You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. I'm here in studio, actually in studio, for the first time out of 100 that we've said live in studio with Billy Galanko. Billy, what's it like being in person for the first Vint Podcast episode? I had a friend in college that used to say, "Yeah, Brady, he looks great from a mile away." That's what
That's very kind of him.
Yeah, but our team is out here in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, for a little company retreat, company offsite, and we leading up to the Christmas holiday, we have a few things we want to touch on, and obviously an interview to bring listeners today. But did you drink anything recently other than the wines we've had this week?
We drank a few things over the last weekend. But one thing, it's more, rather than talking about what I'm drinking, it's something that I've had a recent pet peeve of. Have you seen any pet nats that have been labeled zero dosage in Brut Nature?
Brut Nature, yeah.
For pet nats?
I think so, yeah. I'm just like, I don't pick them up a lot at the store, but I feel like I have, yeah.
No. So I think Brut Nature is technically true.
Isn't that given?
But again, the same thing with the dosage. The zero dosage, I've been seeing this on pet nat things.
Yeah.
You can't have a dosage if you never have a secondary fermentation. Okay, I'm going to explain this because I've been explaining to everybody and nobody cares. So for a sparkling wine, you have the primary fermentation, you make a base wine. Then you put the liquor de tirage in, you put some yeast and sugar in, and then you put it back in, put a pop cap on it in the bottle, and you lay that down, and it ferments again and makes bubbles. Then to get that yeast and stuff out, the lees, after it's matured for however long, you either work it down, you have that little cap of yeast, and you disgorge it. You shoot out that cap of yeast, and then after that, you put in the dosage. So you make it brut, you make it extra brut. If you don't put anything in, it's Brut Nature.
Yeah.
But that dosage is basically after the secondary fermentation when it was disgorged. So if you have a pet nat, you're putting the wine in when it's still going through primary fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
So then you never take the top off. You're not disgorging anything.
Yeah.
So there's no opportunity to actually put a dosage in. So I'm seeing all of these pet nats lately, especially in LA, that literally have every buzzword you could possibly want.
Sure.
There's Brut Nature, there's no dosage, there's pet nat. They literally put all these words hoping somebody will recognize one, and then they'll buy it.
And it's all true.
It is all technically true.
Yeah. Maybe that's, are they local? Not local, but
the one with
California producers, or is it something you saw on more commercial, larger labels?
I think this was a private label. It was Italian wine, but I think it was a private label. But again, the friend of ours who brought it on this trip that we were on, she had no idea what any of the words meant except for pet nat.
Mm-hmm.
And she just liked the color because it was orange and had like an interesting label. So I think they're just trying to get anybody to recognize anything.
Yeah. Wow. Hitting the buzzwords in an emerging category, I guess, is super helpful. But I wouldn't let it get to you.
Clearly it has it.
Super stressed.
I've been explaining it to so many people who have no idea what any of those words mean. So yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I could definitely be conflating just scanning the sparkling wines generally in a store and thinking, oh yeah, maybe I've seen that. I've seen Brut Nature on a wine like that. But honestly, I can't remember the last time I looked at a pet nat wall or end cap or something like that. But we are, today is Wednesday the 13th. And that means we are 12 days away from Christmas. So we thought we'd do a 12 wines for 12 days leading up to Christmas. And we use wines loosely in that I think we have maybe some spirits, at least one on this list, and not just specific wines, but also maybe producers or regions, or really just 12 interesting or wines, regions, producers to look out for. And we wanted to give you 12 of them leading up to Christmas. So that's our theme for the intro today. And I will let you kick off with the first of what's on your list. You have 6 and I have 6, and we can go back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my 6 are going to be basically the top. It's just going to be my past year, a year and change in wine.
Okay.
So basically I'm just going through some of my most memorable wines of the past. It'll be 13 months.
Yeah. So start on your list. Give us 5 sentences of why it's interesting, why it should make this list, and I'll go.
Yes. So my first one is going to be Barolo and Piemonte. wines in general, so pretty broad. I went last November, not this past one, but the one before, for truffle season. And it was basically amazing to see everything in person. It was my first time there. So we toured GD, Vira, and Vietti. It was pretty cool because we work with a bunch of those wines, especially at the marketplace now. And we got to taste a lot. I got to, at GD Vira, the family, still family run. I got to taste with everybody there. Almost like they were sisters, brothers. The dad wasn't there, but it was really cool. And not only did they have Nebbiolo-based wines, but they also had a lot of their more obscure ones. They had some Fresia, Barbera, Dolcetto. Not that Barbera is that rare, but it was kind of cool to taste some of these lesser known wines. So I think Piemonte and Barolo as a whole are my favorites. They're not my favorites. That's my number one. And yeah, check out Vietti too.
So it's not only your first day of Christmas category, but it's also your favorite out of the list that you'll give, or does it just happen to be number one?
No, I didn't mean favorite. It just happens to be number one as it was first chronologically. I'm going in chronological order.
I see. Okay. Well, I'll go with number two. Day two, I'll go with, we've talked about Virginia wines a lot this past year on the podcast, or at least I have. And so we'll go with Linden Estates or Linden Vineyards in outside of Shenandoah Valley area. And their winemaker and founder, Jim Law, who started making wine in Virginia in the early 80s. And is one of the grandfathers or great uncles of modern or last 40 years of Virginia winemaking. So they make wonderful wines out of the Bordeaux varieties. They're just estate claret, they call it, is $30, super approachable, can age, fresh right away. Yeah, awesome way to be introduced to some of the varieties that are really thriving in Virginia and get a little bit of history along with.
Cool. My number two is going to be broad, but it'll be champagne. And mainly for a few reasons. One, I passed my sparkling diploma exam last year with whatever the second level of honors is. I think it's distinction, because I think merit's number one. So that was really exciting. I had my first Cristal last year, which was also exciting. And my fiance and I got engaged. And after that, we immediately went to lunch and we had a Domaine de Bicherie La Source champagne to celebrate. It was basically just one they had on the menu, but it's one that I'll remember. So that was exciting. So it was a good year for sparkling for me.
Nice. And good memories are tied to it too.
Likewise.
Yeah. This year was for me, I'm going to go to a whiskey now. This year was a big year of discovery not out completely, but an evolution from only drinking in terms of American whiskey, bourbon, moving into rye and things like that, and then even venturing into Scotch. And so I'm going to go with a rye producer and High West Distillery and their Midwinter Night Dram, which has gotten a good amount of press recently because they've massively increased production of this wine or this whiskey, which is typically really highly allocated. It's a port finished rye whiskey. And typically, right now, you're going to find it for somewhere between 180 and 299, depending on where you're looking. But they actually increased production this year, or I guess it's in coming batches, more than 50%. And so that combined with some conversation that I've heard that the whiskey is a lot younger these days than it used to be. And so there's maybe some mixed feelings about how that's changed the product. Some people like it. Some people are kind of off it. It's a whiskey that I love. I think it's still the best rye that I have on my shelf right now, and one that should become more readily available in the coming 18 months as they kind of ramp up. Yeah. Midwinter Night Dram from High West.
That's exciting. Yeah, we're in the market for a rye. So I think maybe we'll get that one, replace our missing one in our house.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go with a spirit now too. I have a few of these wines actually from our Provence trip last year. But one will be actually a spirit. It's going to be a chartreuse. I think the chartreuse is something that everybody, especially wine nerds, can identify with because there's so much complexity and nuance that you have to learn to understand which of these were bottled when, like a mystery. It's a fun puzzle. With this hotel we were at, I basically was checking out their bar. It was a very nice hotel. It was actually opened by, oh my God, I forgot his name. But it's a guy who has a number of Michelin star restaurants around the world. And this is like a private getaway full hospitality experience. And so the chartreuse that I'm going to highlight here is La Reine des Liqueurs. Basically means like the queen liqueur. It was a 2,400 bottle run that they did at the 1972 proof, or they basically tried to make it a 1972 batch. So that was really cool. really hard to find. It's heavily allocated, even in France. So I saw it behind the counter, ordered it. The lady forgot to charge me for it. So it was amazing. And it was going to be like 50 euros otherwise for the little glass. So it was awesome.
Yeah, nice. My next one will be a value fine wine category that's continuing its emergence, and talking about South America, specifically Argentina and Chile. And we did a little bit of talking this year on the podcast about those regions, and just calling out those obviously countries we're talking about, which all have subregions and their own sort of unique characteristics, but really calling out some of the top producers that we've mentioned on the podcast and that we've actually also featured in a South American collection on our Cheval de Andes and Senya in Chile and Catina Zapata, which ever expanding their release of estate wines. And I think a lot of really great value from some of those producers, and not only the large producers that I mentioned, but some boutique projects that are, I think really reviving the region. And you will see those wines continue to increase in value, I believe, over the next 5 to 10 years and beyond. So now's probably a good time to get into some of those.
Yeah. Shout out to our good buddy Vince Anter, who's been on the podcast because his Chile episode just dropped.
That's right. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. I'm going to a watch party and meeting him this weekend, or hopefully. So on the vein of value, I think my next 3 actually are value buys, but they're all really quality for the region. So one is just going to be Chablis in general. I still think compared to some of the, Côte de Beaune Chardonnays from Burgundy, you can still find amazing value in Chablis, even down to general Village Chablis. The one that sticks out to me most last year was the Pâtés Loup, basically meaning the wolf's paw, 2018 from Thomas Pio. Another wine we had on our trip, absolutely amazing. I think I saw it recently listed potentially on the Vint Marketplace, but it's under $100. It's an amazing wine. And I think Chablis in general, you can get a really good bang for your buck.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. Sticking with white wines and white wines from France, I'm going to go with a Bordeaux Blanc and specifically Semillon as a variety. Typically Bordeaux Blancs, and correct me, but Semillon, Sauvignon Blanc, and another variety,
some like Muscadel, but
Muscadel.
The majority of the dry ones are mostly Sauvignon Blanc with Semillon rounding it out.
But high acid, the Semillon adds definitely some body and roundness to those wines. They can age wonderfully. You make them in a dry style or also in a late harvest, or I guess a botrytized style.
And those wines are more Semillon than...
Yeah, that's right. So you talk about Suderat and Yquem, and some great wines that you can have in your cellar for a long time. I know that they'll improve with age, and also most of the time get in at a pretty accessible price point for sure for those. And so anytime I can pick up a wine that I know I can drink now and enjoy, but also set a few aside for the future and not pay that much, that's an exciting value proposition.
Yeah, I think I've heard a lot of people in the biz complain about how Bordeaux Blanc over the past 20 years, they all gravitated, like with the success of New Zealand, Sauvignon Blanc, to a certain style. And now they're starting to come back and make wines again like they did in the 90s and before. Yeah. So I think now I highly agree. I think everybody should be checking out Bordeaux Blanc, because I think it's forgotten, really. I'm going to flip my next 2 and go this one with the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, another really value region. Great, really easily drinkable and yet interesting red wines. Perfect for most holiday meals. And I think it's hard to argue that the top producer from there is not Emilio Pepe. So I had my first of his wines this year. I had a 2013 on my birthday. It was great. His style is very, very low intervention. I guess modern day people call it natural almost, but it's very funky. This one had a little bit of barnyard. You're going to get a lot of that earthy, and it's really more of a primal kind of feral Montepulciano. But you can get really great producers in that one, even just around $20 or a little bit more. His wines are more, obviously, but even the best wines are not that expensive overall.
Nice. Yeah.
Aren't they under $20?
Yeah, that's good. I'm thinking which one to do next right now. I'm going to go with the sparkling and talking about Cremant de Bourgogne, and specifically Kir is the pronunciation.
Well, when you, yeah.
So Kir, which you take the Cremant, it's a sparkling wine, and add a creme de cassis liqueur or cassis liqueur to the sparkling and kind of create a Burgundian cocktail of sorts, Burgundian spritzer, I guess we might call it. here in the US. And a really interesting way to mix up your drinking routine. And actually these, I didn't realize, but these cassis liqueurs there's like two different classifications. There's a classification system for them in that region. And it's two different distinctions. I can't go into all of that detail, but that's something to maybe explore. And also think about adding a little pink, dark purple juice to your sparkling wine. It's interesting.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. On that note, not to confuse everybody, but my last two are going to be Provence-based wine regions. Two of the most famous. So when people think of Provence, they think of rosé, and they make a lot more wine than that. But two of the most famous, one is a red and one is a white. Regions would be Bandol, and not to confuse everybody else, but the other one is Cassis, just one S in the middle. So Bandol, known for producing really long-aged or ageable, long-lived, really full-bodied red wines from Mourvedre. Domaine Tempier is one of the most famous. I was lucky enough to go there this year. It was awesome. We get a lot of sales for that on the marketplace, both their rosé and their regular reds. Again, amazing value. And then Cassis, I'm going to go with Clos Magdalen as my top producer. Cassis is it's like a little seaside town. It's really pretty, and there's not that many producers anyway. And Clos Magdalen has this vineyard that juts out on this rocky plateau peninsula. That's absolutely amazing.
Nice.
And their wines were awesome. I tried to bring some home. Had to leave them in the airport for miscellaneous reasons, but both of those wines, when I had them while I was there, were awesome.
Nice.
They're the producers.
Well, this is my last one. So do you have one more? You do. No. Okay. So this is day 12. This is the last one. And I actually did a little pivot here because I realized that we talk so much about, the farm winery in Paso, and I raved about their Grenache. I really found myself drinking more Grenache, and specifically just Central Coast and just California Grenache in general. And so I thought it would be right to call out Jim Madsen and his partner Santiago Archival, who's a winemaker at the farm, and actually makes wine in Mendoza as well. So shout out to the South American producers. But yeah, I think this Grenache that's grown in these climates that are typically, think of like pretty warm, ripens a decent, really ripe fruit. But some of these producers growing at higher altitudes, or maybe with special maritime influences, or where the vineyards we're getting some of that cooling effect. I just really love that dichotomy and Grenache that's being grown in regions where you have like diurnal shift like that. And so I think it's really interesting. It was creating a style that I like a lot. And so shout out to Jim Madsen and the farm on the West Side Paso, making other things other than Grenache, but really excellent Grenache.
Yep.
That's day 12.
I don't think it would be a Brady countdown if Paso didn't make
Paso had to make the list. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we were able to end it up there. I encourage everybody just to check out Grenache. It's right all over the place as well.
Yeah.
I think there's some really cool regions coming on as well. But yeah, let's get to our interview for today. It is with Francesca. She goes by Chess Martin. I first heard her on a Club de Vin, which is like this NFT wine club thing. Everybody should look into it. And they're one of their founders, David Garrett. We speak with him regularly here at Vint, just on various topics. And I was on one of their webinars, and they had her on Chess to speak about kind of what was going on in the Asian market. And I thought that was really interesting. Her background, she made wine in Argentina and some other places for a while, and she bounced around in the wine trade and different things. So I thought that was really fascinating. And then I reached out to her to see if she'd be interested to come on the podcast, learned a little bit more about what she actually does. She helped found a company called Nimbility, which she's a founding partner now, and basically helps wine brands try to understand and navigate the markets in Asia. They help them create a plan to launch their wines in each individual market. So in this episode, she talks about kind of what goes into making the Asian market unique compared to Western markets, kind of what the consumer is looking at, what some of their drinking occasions are, and then all some of the nuances that some companies you would never think they really have to take into account on the West and launching in, say, Europe or America. Some things with trademarks, coming up with a Chinese name, for example, for that market.
Yeah, I think it's a topic we haven't explored at all in the podcast, really talking about Asian markets, mainly because you and I don't have a ton of knowledge about the intricacies there. But she brought up so many points that I think will be interesting in terms of juxtaposing how we as consumers typically navigate the wine market here in the West and even consume wine here in the West. It's totally different out there. And she continues this trend too of wine professionals born, raised in the UK who tasted wine from a family member in middle school and then got hooked, which is just, it wasn't my experience, but I think has a really cool story and obviously a wealth of information and an experience in a market that isn't our own.
All right. Without further ado, here's Chess Martin. Thank you so much for joining us, Chess.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah, we were really excited to have you since I heard you on another webinar, actually, with Club de Vin. I was on there and basically Dave had introduced Chess, and it was really interesting background and kind of everything that she was talking about. I realized we hadn't talked about at all on the Vint podcast. So we're really excited to have you explain what you do, explain the nuances of selling wine in Asia and get into all that. But first, could you tell us a little bit about who you are and a little bit about your background and how you got into wine?
I can, yeah. So thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. My name is Chess Martin, or Francesca is my full name. Sadly, no Italian blood that I know of, but I feel quite Italian in my soul. Anyway, most people know me as Chess. I got into wine about 20 years ago now. I was studying Spanish at university and needed to take a year abroad to learn Spanish fluently. And I'd always had a passion with food, wine, hospitality. I'd been working in hospitality and had a sort of interest in food and wine. My mother came from a sort of culinary background as an amazing chef. So I'd always been surrounded by flavors and food and incredible meals and that sort of thing. And my father had a keen passion, or has a keen passion in wine. So that really sparked the interest, I think. And I managed to sort a job on a winery out in Argentina, in Mendoza, in the Valle de Uco. So that was my first foray into wine when I was 21. So went into the middle of nowhere, really, in the Uco Valley, and worked for Jacques and Francois Louton on their incredible winery out in Vista Flores. And I never looked back, really. I just got completely bitten. I think it's quite difficult to probably go to Argentina and sit Malbec overlooking the Andes Mountains and the vineyards. And it was just I was just blown away really by everything that Argentina had to offer, but particularly wine. That sort of took me, I did a harvest there. I then ended up working with Dave at Club de Vin. So he was running a company at the time called the Vines of Mendoza, and I worked on a private vineyard sort of project for him, which was a really fun project to get involved in, basically sourcing the best Malbecs and wines from Argentina at the time and sending them to prospective buyers of private vineyards. So that was a really fun project. And went back to England after a year to finish my degree and got another job straight afterwards with Miguel Torres out in Spain. So by that point, I knew that I wanted to work in wine and this was the industry for me. But I was working more on the technical side in the wineries. And my background at school had actually been sort of biology, chemistry, as well as languages. So I ended up sort of in the lab, working as a technician because I could. And that's really where I learned all about winemaking. And eventually I decided that I needed to be in a center where I could taste wines from all over the world. And when you live in a country a country that produces wine, you tend to get very sucked in just to those particular styles. And I really wanted to learn about the world of wine in general. And I just had a real craving for knowledge, I think, at that point. So I moved back to London and started working with Liberty Wines, very well-established top importer, distributor. And really that was where I got my background in terms of education. So I did my diploma, they put me through my diploma, and I ended up working on the sort of brand management side, which took me into the business of wine, I suppose. And it was an incredible experience, learned all sorts of things about wines from all over the world. And it was a really amazing foundation to set me up, I think, for my career. And so spent 5 years there, really, really amazing experience. But as seems to be a pattern with me, I got itchy feet after about 5 years and decided to look further afield and see what the next adventure was. And I spent my mentor at the time, wonderful man, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, a man called Stephen Spurrier, sadly no longer with us. We used to go for dinners and lunches together and chat about what my next move was. And at the time, this was in 2012, he was doing a lot of work out in Asia. So working for consulting to Singapore Airlines and he'd set up the Decanter Fine Wine Encounter and the Decanter World Wine Awards out in Asia. So he said to me, you should really go and look at what's happening in China and what's happening in Asia. So I got on a plane, packed my bags, went out to Shanghai and Hong Kong. And I had a few friends in both cities. And just really I just went knocking on doors, really. I handed around my CV. I figured out who the biggest companies were and the ones that I liked the look of. Handed my CV around. And yeah, by the time I got back on the plane from that trip, I had a few job offers on the table. I took a role with a big company, one of the leading wine and spirits importers in China called ASC. And they had a role for me in Hong Kong as a brand manager. So I took that position, basically running their prestige and luxury side of their portfolio from a brand management standpoint. And that really got me into Hong Kong. It got me into sort of China, Asia, just the buzz of the market. And within a year, though, because I'd had a lot of contacts from the wineries that I've been working with back in the UK, a lot of people were just asking me what I could do to help them in Asia. And that sort of really got me thinking about what my next move was. And really, I suppose at that point, I was conceptualizing what is my company today, which is Nimbility. It took the form of a smaller company back then. And at the same time, I started studying for the Master of Wine. So I was still very, very keen to learn everything that I possibly could about the subject. And I actually at that point set up on my own. So I decided to take on a small number of brands to essentially rep out in Asia. So export and brand management while I was studying. And the studies took over for a little while, as they tend to. And I was very focused on the Master of Wine for a while teaching at the same time. So I'd set myself up by then to teach WSET and things like that. So I'm doing a mix of consulting and teaching and repping a number of brands. And took a few attempts at the MW. And I think it was on my second attempt. So I first passed the theory first time, which was a real shock. And then I failed at the tasting a couple of times. And it was after I'd failed a couple of times the tasting and I'd put a lot of work and effort in that I had a bit of a reset. And I thought, hang on, if I never quite get there with this exam, what's left? And at that point, I really pivoted back to the business and realized that what I needed to do was put my heart and soul into that and build it with a team. And so at that point, I started to look for partners and had a real stroke of luck that my current business partner, wonderful man called Ian Ford, who had a number of years ago set up another very big wine and spirits distributor called Summergate in China. He founded that company and sold it to Woolworths in 2014. Him and I got chatting and we really conceptualized Nimbility, which is the company we set up back in 2018. And what we do at Nimbility is we call ourselves market builders. So what that entails is taking on a winery or a spirits brand, or we even have what we call premium beverage, so non-alcoholic beverages, things like that, tonic waters. We basically set up route to market. So find the right import and distribution partners for our brands in the Asian markets. And then we really build the strategy that goes behind those brands. Everything from building that strategy and then helping the importers to implement it and really build brand. because in these markets in particular, it's very important to develop that consumer franchise and build that pull through the distribution system. So that's what Nimbility does. I think that's a little potted history. I'm sure there might be some questions, but yeah, that's how I've got to Asia.
Yeah, a world traveler for sure in the wine space. I want to jump back to when you first mentioned clients from the UK and Europe becoming interested in the Asian markets and wanting to bring your perspective into that. Was there a specific trigger in the market that prompted those conversations, or did that kind of just happen over time as it has been over the last few decades? Or was there a specific trigger in the market that got them interested?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's different for every market in Asia is at a slightly different point in its history. So it's hard to generalize. We talk about APAC, but really it's 15 different markets, all of which are very, very different. But I think one of the key triggers, and obviously one of the biggest markets in Asia is China, and we spend a lot of time focusing in China. It's a very complex market. I think markets like Hong Kong, obviously, which we consider part of that greater China region, they got rid of their tax in 2008. So there's no tax on wine. And I think that had a huge effect in terms of interest and certainly in terms of sort of shipments. And at the same time, you had that real sort of interest in Bordeaux. So that was really spiking in China at the time. And I think it was the sort of two things happening together that really, started driving that very significant interest. And it's really just built from there. That's very China specific. However, markets like Singapore, Japan, Indonesia, Thailand, they've all had very different histories when it comes to wine. And many of them are still developing. A market like Japan has a much more developed historical it's more of a sort of mature market, really, compared to many of the others out in this part of the world.
Was there a specific trigger on the rise in interest in Bordeaux at that time in the Asian markets?
Yeah, there definitely was. There was a big sort of interest. What exactly inspired it is anyone's guess, but I think it was the Chinese in general there was a lot more disposable income and people were really looking at, I think, just luxury items in general, and wine was definitely one of those. And it really became part of the banquet entertaining moment, which is a big one for China. And that was really building up until around 2012, 2013, when the anti-austerity campaign came in. And then that business entertainment moment was very much clamped down on. So the volume came down. But there had been, up until that point, there had been a lot of very lavish entertainment. And I think wine, particularly Bordeaux, the 1980s, 82s, etc., that sort of very much fitted into that moment. And so they were very sought after at that point in time. But things have now changed and moved on. Things move very, very fast in this part of the world, particularly in China. Burgundy is really what people are looking for, as with the rest of the world. That I think definitely impacted, and there was a lot of noise around, particularly brands like Chateau Lafite became very, very famous and very well known. And then Penfolds obviously had their moment. So that sort of happened subsequently, I would say, to the sort of Bordeaux craze. There was then this real sort of phenomenon around Penfolds, who were also incredibly successful. Again, nobody quite knows exactly why. It was lots of different things, I think, happening at the same time. That's definitely a brand that has a huge amount of consumer franchise in the market.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think let's maybe take a little step back here, because I want to ask you some questions. I know the market is each kind of market is its own thing, but I want to talk a little bit about the general differences that you've seen or nuances of the Asian consumer right now, just on a very macro level. And then we can dive into some of the specific markets and then maybe talk about a few of the nuances of China in particular towards the end, like the trademarking and some of those types of things. But what are you seeing on the whole in terms of drinking preferences in the Asian market? And then also, can you talk a little bit about like how explaining things like tasting notes or even pairing is a completely different game for these folks when they're trying to consider their wines and their occasions as well?
Yeah, sure. So Asia is driven predominantly by red wine, which sort of goes against many of the sort of climate conditions that you might find here. I think I think it's stemmed from fine wine, I suppose, and much of wine sort of being drunk by people at more sort of luxury, lavish occasions, and so red wine, particularly top class, all the sort of first growth, but Bordeaux, things like that, really fitting into that moment. And so it's often in contrast to some of the more tropical climates that you might find, particularly in Southeast Asia or southern China. A lot of these places are quite hot. And so you'd expect sort of white wine or rosé to potentially be better, particularly with a lot of the food. A lot of Asian food obviously has a spice component to it. So it's not necessarily the best food pairing for some of these bigger, heavier tannic reds. But I think that definitely, that has driven the market. It's driven the interest. It's driven the prestige, I suppose, of wine. But now what we're seeing is people drinking less for the prestige and more because they enjoy wine as a beverage alcohol, as a drink. And I think things are slowly diversifying, particularly in places like China. We see a real genuine interest now in wine for drinking in different styles. White wine is definitely on the rise, still heavily dominated by red, but particularly in first-tier cities with things like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, German Riesling with a brand like Dr. Lucen has been very successful, and even sparkling wine. And there's a lot of sort of interest now, I think, that has been built in lots of these markets. And so we really are seeing lots of different trends, very niche in most instances still at the moment. But most of the things that are happening in the West are slowly infiltrating into Asia in their own way. An interesting one, and we spend a lot of time because we have a number of rosé brands, but that's a trend that we're all still waiting to happen out here. I think rosé is perfect for many of the markets out here, particularly Southeast Asia. It goes really well with the food. It's a very easy, sort of fun way to drink wine, but it hasn't quite had the same boom, I would say, as markets like the UK and the US. But we're driving that trend, so we'll see what happens in the next few years. But yeah, just going back to your, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just going to drill down a little bit on because I think the food pairing thing and the distinctions there are pretty interesting, because some of the, maybe, especially in the red category, the most valuable sought after wines in the West, just like you said, don't necessarily, you don't think of them as much in pairing well with the cuisine, Asian cuisine. When you think of some of the sparkling wines, sweeter wines, Tokai and Bordeaux Blanc, are you seeing more interest in those categories that kind of fit more traditionally as a pairing with that cuisine?
Yeah, it's a funny one because, again, every market's slightly different in this respect. And I think in many markets, particularly those that are driven by Chinese influence, the food pairing moment isn't as important as it is in the West. Or certain areas really picked up, or certain countries really sort of picked up on that. So in a market like Singapore, for instance, you have a lot of very high-end restaurants. A lot of them do tasting menus. Same in Japan. And you'll see that pairing of a particular wine with a particular dish. In China, the traditional way of eating is very communal, and this sort of links into occasions when you would drink wine, right? Wine and alcohol in general in this part of the world is very much drunk occasions and with other people. So it's very, it's all about toasting. It's all about drinking with your friends, with your colleagues, with business associates. and really sharing that moment and sharing food. And the Chinese dining sort of dinner banquet is all sorts of different things on the table at the same time, and many, many different alcohols being drunk at the same time as well. So it's much less about whether this wine works with this dish. It's really just everything all at once. And it's much more casual. People are making toasts, and it's a fun way of I suppose embracing that occasion and embracing that moment, which is quite different, I think, to the West. And it gives lots of different possibilities to slot in, depending on, you can be any beverage alcohol really, and almost fit into that moment, which makes it quite flexible, which is interesting and yeah, definitely slightly different in that respect. So it depends on the market, and it depends as well on the occasion. But I think it's important to definitely note that generally in Asia, drinking is very much associated with going out and with being with your friends, being with those business associates. It's not nearly as common to drink at home, for example, or even to entertain at home. And that's often to do with things like just the sort of practicality of small apartments in a market like Hong Kong, for instance, or Japan. People are much more used to going out for dinner and going out with friends. And really, home is just where you sleep. It's not necessarily where you entertain. That did change for a number of markets during COVID. So we've seen big rises in home entertainment in a market like Singapore. In Korea, for example, it became much more common and almost quite trendy to drink at home, to be with small groups of friends. So that is a bit of a shift that we've seen. But certainly home consumption in a market like China it still has a lot of room to grow and develop. And that's something that's quite different from what we see in the UK and the US.
Those are, I think that's really fascinating, the consideration of just like the practicality of the space that most people are drinking in and finding themselves. I think that's really interesting. Was there just maybe on a sort of, to get a personal anecdote, are there any kind of experiences that come to mind for you when you first got more immersed in that culture that kind of introduced you to this new way of consuming wine and experiencing sort of these more, I guess, communal settings in which people were drinking? Do you have some kind of moments that come to mind that really got you enraptured in that movement, what's happening there?
Many, many moments. So working with ASC, there was pretty much one of those moments every week. But a particular one was, I remember we went out for a team dinner, and this was quite a regular occurrence. But my boss had come down from Shanghai, and he enjoyed toasting. Let's just put it that way. So the traditional way of drinking wine, actually, when you sit around a sort of Chinese banquet table, is to gambe. And you get your glass topped up, and then someone will stand up and say something, and everyone does the gambe, which is essentially bottoms up, and you're meant to drain your glass. So it can be quite dangerous. You need to be prepared, but it's a lot of fun. And yeah, as I said, there's lots of different foods on the table, and the wine keeps coming, and generally there's some baijiu thrown in there and all sorts of other things. It can be a lot of fun, but certainly quite dangerous. You have to try and pace yourself if you can. It's not always easy.
So some of that sounds a little bit more like Western culture then too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. People like to drink. They definitely like to drink. So,
but unlike the Western culture, it is considered offensive if you ignore somebody. If they want a gambe or cheers and you just don't do anything, they get offended by that. So it's harder to get by and moderate.
It is, yeah, particularly, which is why actually I think particularly being a woman, it's nice that wine has come into the equation rather than just baijiu, because that can get you into tricky situations quite completely. But yes, it is. It's I spent a lot of time having conversations on the side with waiters and waitresses, and just pour a little bit into my glass. As opposed to a whole glass full of 15% Zinfandel. Yeah, it's definitely a few moments. And often when you're in China, they do enjoy bringing out, and particularly I had it in Hong Kong, ordering the most funky dish on the menu and watching how the Westerner copes is always quite an amusing game, I think, for for most of them. Yeah. So lots of chicken's feet, which I've never worked out how to eat properly with chopsticks. I think you have to be Chinese to be able to cope with that.
I don't know. I've had some good chicken feet. My partner, my fiance is Taiwanese, so we've gone the gambit. It's more like her parents are more afraid of offending me, but I'm like, bring it on, and we'll eat anything.
Yeah. It's fun. You've got to try these things.
For sure.
Might not enjoy them, but
yeah, if you close, a lot of them also taste a lot better than you think they would.
Exactly. It's better to find out afterwards, once you've eaten it, what it actually is.
Oh, for sure. On that note of tasting notes, and then I kind of want to talk about the markets, a little bit of the nuances, maybe the top 3 or 4 markets. And we discussed this a little bit before our call, when you're trying to explain tasting notes to folks and people aren't really understanding like black currants, maybe they've never had that before, or any of the old traditional tasting notes that maybe we all are familiar with for say Bordeaux. Did you have to change that in your classes to understand more their flavor vocabulary, or how have you adjusted to that nuance?
Yeah, so I did have to do quite a bit of that. I think it was where I saw it most prominently, actually, was when I was teaching in the Philippines. And I think the Philippines is a very, very new wine market. And I think that the sort of flavors and tastes that people are exposed to in all of these different markets are actually significantly different. And in the Philippines, they really don't get access to sort of British winter grown fruit. And obviously a lot of the wine language that we all learn comes out of this very sort of Western culture. And it's built up on smells and things that we know from particular seasons and in particular countries even. And that just does not translate in a market like the Philippines. You're talking tropical fruit, and lots of their sort of food culture is influenced by many different places. But the food is very full in flavor. And I think there I had to really try and find things that they may have smelt or tasted. I was always encouraging them to go into international supermarkets and try and just, smell things that maybe they had never tasted before. And they would often pick up on more of the sort of tropical fruits and things. Yeah, you just have to adapt a bit and try and find things that they would have in their sort of taste palette, maybe, because often there would be something that you could find that they were familiar with that could replicate, or that would have a certain sense of smell, or you could explain it in a different way. But that was quite interesting for me, definitely, looking at room full of blank faces when you refer to something like elderflower or gooseberry. No one in Asia has any idea what a gooseberry is. I don't think most people in the West really have any idea what a gooseberry is either, because it's so niche. But you see it on every single Sauvignon Blanc tasting note for the Loire Valley. So it's things like that. You have to get a bit more creative, but it's fun. And I think they taste in a different way because of, I think we all do, because of what we're exposed to in terms of sort of flavor. And I think in the Asian markets, people are exposed to umi a lot more. They're exposed to that sort of sweet, sour combination that's happening. Salt is obviously used, but often in combination with sugar, and certainly bitterness and also tannin because of things like drinking tea. So none of these things are foreign. It's just how people are experiencing them and how people have experienced them through particularly food, and how you can then connect that into wine and what you're tasting.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to ask.
That's definitely been really interesting.
Nice.
To taste with lots of different cultures.
For sure. I was going to ask about the tea part too and the texture. I think that's something that is hard to explain to a lot of people, but I feel like they would understand more just what tannin is and the different levels of tannin as well.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think tannin is definitely no stranger to most people in Asia who, there is just a lot more tea drinking here, particularly in Japan and China, Taiwan, etc. So they are exposed to the texture of tannin, and that sort of how you feel that on the palate. Maybe that connects into why red wine has been something that's been more easily accepted. I don't know. But it's definitely the palates are no strangers to tannins. I think that has probably helped red wine particularly.
Makes sense. So you mentioned a few markets there. What would you say? Let's maybe high level 3 or 4 markets, like the most mature, I guess, wine markets, or the fastest growing. You can choose each, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances in China, picking like a Chinese name, trademarks, and all that stuff as well.
Yeah, sure. The most mature market by quite some way is generally considered to be Japan. And they have quite a different preferences, I would say, to the rest of Asia. Sparkling wine, for example, is a good example. But they're a very, very big sparkling wine market, particularly champagne, particularly grower champagne. Anything sort of niche and particularly geeky, the Japanese will go for. So they also have a really big sort of growing interest in things like natural wine, organic wine, orange wine, skin contact, anything that's a little bit more, I suppose, that they can really get into. But the Japanese really study very, very hard. They ask impossible questions. They know more about what you're going to talk about than you do. Which is always, you have to be very, very well prepared for when you're speaking in Japan. But it's great. It teaches you a lot, and they obviously have this incredible food culture, and again, lots of different sort of textures and flavors, and so many different types of Japanese cuisine. So that makes food pairing really, really interesting in Japan, and they're incredibly meticulous. So that's a very interesting market. It's been flat over the past sort of 5 years, and we're seeing quite a big rebound actually this year post-COVID, and quite a lot of movement in the market, quite a lot of dynamism now coming to Japan, which is really nice to see. And it's obviously the second biggest sort of Asia market, so it's quite a significant one. But certain things never really took off in China, for example, never really went mad in Japan. So you have things like Chilean wine is not nearly as big, for instance, as it is in China. And I think the Japanese generally focus in a bit more. So Burgundy is very popular. And as I said, this sort of sparkling wine phenomenon, which we don't really see in the other markets. So it's quite unique and yeah, interesting because it is so different. And as I said, it's been developing over the past sort of 30, 40 years, and just has a lot more, that just sets it apart from most of the other wine markets. So that's an interesting one. And China, you've got China's the big boy. So it's obviously been going through a lot of turmoil, I would say. It's sort of fair to put it like that. It is the market where we see the most potential long term. There's still a huge or very, very low average consumption level. And actually, it is the biggest beverage alcohol market in the world. So it's not going to take a huge amount for either people to convert away from the sort of local alcohol baijiu into wine, and or for new consumers to start drinking wine. And so for us, long term, it's always the market that we have our eye on. And despite the sort of peaks and troughs, the overall interest of consumers in wine that we see, the overall consumer interest is the highest we feel that it's ever been. So I think despite all the doom and gloom in shipments and import stats that we see coming out, our feeling is that long term it will recover. It's just going through a lot of sort of consolidation. A lot of players came into the market sort of 10 years ago, and we're seeing them filter out. OEM brands are obviously, again, filtering out as well, and people are just looking for proper brands, authentic stories, and that's going to be the sort of future, I think, of the China market as consumer interest really sparks and continues to develop.
Yeah.
And then a market.
Just briefly, I want to jump in on when you're talking about consumer trends a little bit. It made me think tangentially about sort of wine tourism and wine travel. And, if I took someone from maybe one of these Asian countries and they wanted to come to the US and experience wine, I would send them to a vineyard. But I would be interested in going and experiencing the varied aspects in which people consume wine, these social settings and stuff like that. How would someone, if you were telling a tourist from the West coming to Asia to experience, just call it wine culture in, say, China, how might someone do that? What would be some of the things that you would direct them to maybe go and do and experience?
That's a really good question. Well, I think it depends how broad and how deep, I suppose, you want to go. So if you ended up or you'd start off in a city like Shanghai. So Shanghai is a trend. It's where the trends get set, and it's an international sort of really buzzing, forward-thinking city. And you will find all sorts of wine bars and trendy restaurants and everything from traditional Chinese cuisine up to incredible sort of Michelin star French. You can find anything in a city like Shanghai. It's a very international sort of place. So that's going to look very, very different to even Beijing, for example, where things are generally a lot more traditional. Again, you're probably going to have more of that traditional Chinese cuisine, and certainly more of that traditional sort of dining, banqueting occasion would be something that you would see, in contrast to Shanghai, where you might be going out with groups of friends and it would be a bit more low-key and a bit more, convivial. With Beijing, you've got all of this business entertainment, and it's going to be more potentially around that Chinese banqueting occasion. Once you've moved out then away from first-tier cities into second, third, fourth tier, that's looking very, very different again. Most people are that point buying and consuming wines in very different ways. Again, a lot of the traditional sort of dining, entertaining moment is when most people will be experiencing wine, but they'll be buying it off local wholesalers. They'll be buying it potentially through e-commerce, through sort of group purchase buys. And retail, I think, is really interesting in China. Everyone gets very or thinks about retail in their experience of retail, which if you're from the US or the UK or even Europe, you have these big supermarket groups, and those really dominate the retail arena. In China, it's incredibly fragmented. So actually, where most people, particularly in second, third, fourth tier cities, are buying their wine, they're going to be buying them at these sort of local, what we call mom and pop stores. Just tiny little sort of corner shops, really. And that's going to be dominated predominantly by some bigger brands. So your Penfolds, DBR Lafite, the things that consumers at that level will recognize, and they'll be buying those wines and taking them to consume with groups of friends, the Chinese restaurant. So that's and the other thing that obviously, if you were going to do wine tourism in China, you would definitely want to go out to some of the wineries. So there's some really, really interesting wineries, and wine production in China has obviously gone through a lot of development in the past sort of 20 years. There's been a lot of investment into the area, and there's some really good results coming out. So if you see any Chinese wine sort of through your local wine shops and potentially online, I don't know where they might be selling in the US, but some of those top brands may well now be exporting, and you might be able to find them, and they're well worth trying. Doing a bit of research and trying some of those top wines, because they are now starting to compete with high level wines from the rest of the world, which is really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the state has willed some of these wines to the top, and they're starting to win awards, which is really, really interesting. I guess you mentioned brands. I guess we'll get there now. Can you tell us, if you were a popular brand in the West, and you wanted to break into the Chinese market, what are some of the things that you need to account for that are basically nobody would ever think of when they're launching a wine in the West? Can you share a couple of those interesting nuances and quirks?
Yeah, sure. And this is what Nimbility does day in, day out. Yeah, we're quite well equipped to talk on the subject. But it is a huge China. The reason why we do so much work in China is not only because of its potential and size and scale, but also because it is the most complex market for sure to access and then to understand, comprehend and build in really. It's a very, very opaque market. And I think a lot of people find it very frustrating. And a lot of people have obviously been burnt by their experience trying to export to China, because there are just hundreds and hundreds of pitfalls every turn. Yeah, you need one of the first things that we always tell brands to think about is their IP. So trademarking and IP is really, really important in China. The reason being that they have a different system in China for trademarking. So in the West, mostly, you will have a trademark system of first to use rather than first to file. In China, it's first to file, which means that anyone can essentially register for any IP and then own it. So what this has developed is a lot of trademark squatting. So people who will trademark your trademark before you've even had a chance to think of the China market. The chances are it's already owned by someone, and getting that trademark back is going to be very tricky. And so that's something that brands come into problem with regularly. And so anyone looking to take China seriously, I would highly recommend that you check your trademark status in the country, and see if it's actually even able to be registered. Because if it's not, then you may have to think about placing another brand into market, for example. The other thing that people often don't think about is the Chinese name. So in China, when you export and then import a product into China, your product is always registered under a Chinese name. Now, that Chinese name can be developed by you, or it will just be a name that your importer develops to essentially put on the back label of the wine or on the customs declaration forms. So what we always encourage is that brands take that naming process really seriously and create a Chinese name that represents the brand. And again, that's something that the sooner you do that and again, register that Chinese name so that it's protected, the better, because then you can really build the brand in China and the brand will be known under its Chinese name. So you need to have the Western trademark registered, but the brand will become known under its Chinese name, which is, again, complicated to develop and complicated often to register.
Exactly. So have you seen so there's two approaches that I saw when I was working in my Australian wine company that people tried to do. One is they tried to pick a Chinese name that was phonetically similar to their name, but sometimes that led to their name meaning something really weird in Chinese. And other ones, they tried to move away and just pick a name that was really good, number one God wine or something, or king wine in Chinese. Can you give us a couple examples or a couple that complete fails on that line that you've had to help with?
Yeah, I think the important thing is obviously if you can get a phonetic name that sounds like the English name, that sort of helps. It's nice if that can happen. But as you said, Billy, often what happens is that then the characters make no sense. They're not attached to your brand name in any way. So you really need to try and get the two if you can. And actually having characters that come from something, you have to think quite carefully about what your brand represents and then what those Chinese characters are going to be to really connect the two. Because otherwise, it's meaningless. You want to be able, and that's why it's a difficult process, because you need to be able to develop something. And then once you've developed something, you then need to be able to register it. And this is where we come up a lot of times is we create an amazing name, but it's unregisterable. It's unable to be registered because those characters or that character combination has already been registered. And so that's the biggest problem. And what that often means is that we have to find more historical characters or character combinations so that are protect rarer, essentially, and then come up with the names that way. It's a lot of trial and error, and it's definitely something that you want to invest in and try and get right, because essentially that is your brand, or it will become your brand. The biggest problems that people face in China around all of this is when their trademark is owned by someone else. So often in the past, what's happened is the importer has registered a brand name, and then the importer owns the brand. And at some point in time, maybe the importer has refused to give the IP to the brand. And that is a very, very tricky situation, because you don't necessarily want your importer owning your brand, right? They're responsible for the sales and distribution of the product, but technically they shouldn't own your trademark. You should own your IP. And that's where brands sometimes have run into issues, having companies who have not acted in the best faith and have then big sort of legal cases have taken place. So that's happened with a number of the big companies. Sort of Castell Treasury has definitely come up against that as well. So it's best to look early and register, even if you think that you might not go into China. Even it's best just to do your due diligence early and get on the case with that if you are thinking it might be a market of interest in the future.
Yeah, those are definitely some unique challenges that, we certainly have a fair amount of bureaucracy and red tape around these kinds of things in the West or in the US, I guess. But those are some unique challenges.
I think the other thing, thing is, once you understand them, we have a phrase that we use in the office, and it's basically find a way. And with China, often you will find an obstacle, and it's really about how you find there is always a path around it, always. Yeah. But it's just that sort of creative thinking. And I think that's what makes all of us at Nimbility, and myself particularly, love working in these markets, is that you are challenged on an everyday basis. There's no doubt about that. But you can always find a way around. And it's being creative, finding those solutions. And I think that's what makes this work really rewarding. And if everyone had just said, it's too difficult, you would never, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I think it's important to always bear in mind that even though the obstacles seem quite large and often quite terrifying, there is always a way. It just sometimes takes a bit longer to figure it out.
Yeah, let's try and wrap up here with the last obstacle. Well, not the last, but the last major obstacle that comes to mind, especially in a market that has rapidly adopted some of the top, most collectible, highest end wines of the world, but maybe with lagging consumer maturity, probably as those wines flooded into the country. Has there been a unique issue around frauds and fakes with some of these top wines? Are there any unique challenges there, or is it similar to the kinds of schemes that we've seen in the West, just maybe at a different scale?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question. There are definitely more fakes in Asia, I think, than anywhere else in the world. It is a huge problem, but I suppose it's the level of fakes. You have everything from things that are very, very high level and you would probably have no idea, to the obvious fakes. And you see these things, Petrus rebranded, it's the cheap knockoff and the sort of obvious fake. But I think the issue with China is they can do it on such a big scale. So I think that is definitely an issue with the market. And it's also it's become an issue because the consumer is so conscious of it. So if they get a sort of any kind of sense that the wine is fake, that's a big problem. So we're often having to, I suppose in our experience, it happens with things like incorrect information on the documentation for export. This happens quite a lot. But as soon as something has a slightly different label, an incorrect label or some incorrect information, the instant sort of way that people start thinking is, hang on, has this been tampered with? Is this fake? What's going on? And so it's really important, again, I think for wineries to be very cognizant of making sure that when they're producing wines for China, that all the documentation is really correct. Spend time double, triple checking, making sure that the importer has had all the documentation and it's all been checked by all sides, etc. Because it is something that we run into issue with, and the consumer is very sensitive to it. So if there's been a label change, that needs to be explained. It needs to be presented, and because otherwise they just think, hang on, is this a knockoff? Am I being tricked? Am I being duped? What's going on? Yeah, I'd say it's definitely quite prevalent in a market like China, but it's not just wine; it's everything. There have been huge scandals around fake everything in China, so it is something that happens across the board, and it's something just to be aware of, because the consumers are definitely more sensitive of it, I would say, than we generally are in the West.
Awesome. So for the last piece here, to wrap it up, 2 minutes, what would you say the next 5-10 years in terms of trends hold for the Asian market? What's going to continue to grow in popularity there?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think white wine, definitely. We're seeing a lot more sort of interest in white wine and different styles, lighter styles of red wines as well. I think people are definitely moving away from the sort of really big, bold, and sort of styles. I think non-alc is going to have a big impact as well at some point. It's really thriving in the West, and I think we'll see a lot of interest, particularly with the younger generations coming up and just wanting more deliciousness, I would say, in that category. And we're seeing brands now coming to the table with very different offerings to what was available 10 years ago. So there's a lot of dynamism in that particular sector at the moment. I think hopefully rosé will have its moment at some point. It is definitely building in certain markets. I think it's really interesting to consider some of these markets are very driven by tourism, and that can often filter out down into the local market. So Indonesia is a really good example of that. Huge market in barley, for example. And that's really driven by white wine and rosé, driven by tourism, but those sorts of exposure can push those styles out into the main market as well. So that's interesting. I think natural wine definitely has its sort of niche. You're seeing more interest in it. I don't think it's going to be a major trend, but there's always going to be these sort of niches and pockets. Market like Singapore, really dynamic at the moment. Lots and lots going on. And you can really find anything you want in a market like Singapore. Same with Hong Kong. So a lot of these markets are just broadening, I think. And as I said, the consumer interest is definitely higher than ever for wine. And so even though a lot of these markets do have sort of complications, they're not the easiest to get your head around. There's definitely huge growth potential, I would say, for wine moving forwards, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's great to hear. We could continue going on for hours. I remember when we would export wine to Bali, because of their taxes on imports, we would just be sending bladders of must, and then they would ferment it there, and just to get around that. There's so much nuance
around the high taxes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But well, I think we covered a lot, and I think our listeners are really going to get a good insight on the Asian wine market picture. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jess.
Great. I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Awesome. Great. We'll have to have you back on, but thank you for now. Cheers.
Brilliant.
All right. That was our interview with Chess Martin. I hope everybody learned a little bit about the Asian market. I know it's not one market. There's a ton of nuance, and every different country has its own special interests and levels of maturity. So it's really cool to picture what the wine future may look like in each of these markets. So I hope everybody enjoyed the episode, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.